Hey, Coop. Hello. How you doing?
I'm fine. I'm just finishing up my homework.
That's good. What class are you doing?
Dance and film.
Oh, cool. What are you doing for this week?
We watched the life of Vernon and Irene Castle, but a couple weeks ago we watched Whirl of Life, which is a film made by Vernon and Irene Castle.
Okay. What are those movies about?
This one, it's a fictionalized telling of their life where Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers play the characters, as opposed to the Castles playing themselves. They're both about the dancers, Vernon and Irene Castle.
Were they made at the same time?
No, the first one was a silent film made in 1915, and the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers version was made in 1939. It had sound. It was still in black and white, though.
Were they made by the same people?
Vernon Castle wrote the first one. They starred in it, and it's a silent film about them meeting and then becoming famous dancers and their life. It's interesting, though, because there's a bad guy in the first one, John Crosby, who is a suitor of Irene Castle in the beginning, but she doesn't really care for him. And then he gets jealous when she picks Vernon, and he tries to mess with their career. So he keeps trying to open competing theatrical shows to shut them down so that people won't go see theirs. They'll instead go see his. But his always fail. And then he finally gets so desperate that he hires some gangsters to just kidnap her so that they cannot be at the opening night of their big theater, basically Castles by the Sea.
Did they work on both of them?
They did. On the second film, she was more of like a consultant. She's listed in the credits a couple times, including that the costumes were made inspired by fashion of Irene Castle. So that's something. She also had conflict with Ginger Rogers because Ginger Rogers did not want to cut her hair into a bob cut like Irene Castle wore. And Irene Castle was famous for this. She actually popularized the bob cut in the 1920s. And Rogers didn't want to do that. And she also did not want to wear the correct costumes that Irene Castle wore. And she was a fashion icon and stuff. And so Ginger Rogers just had this disagreement with Irene over what the character should be, even though it's her. It is Irene Castle. So, and she didn't want to dye her hair. Like Ginger Rogers said, no, I'm not going to dye my hair to the correct color. I'm going to leave it this lighter color. But I don't know that anything in the first movie wasn't how she wanted it to be, within reason of budget and production availability. But
So if you think you had to name like three big things that were different from one movie to the next, what do you think they would be?
yeah, so I think overall the biggest changes for me would be number one would be the camera work, okay? Because the first film was really static and straight on, and the second one had far more dynamic angles and camera shots, and also some fun like camera trickery and editing effects. So that was really nice. The second biggest change would be the storyline, because in the first film they have some some struggle with like Crosby, but then they become famous. But then they have a big tension of now he kidnaps Irene. Whereas in the second film, they meet, and then there's no bad guy in a person, but the tension is their professional life. So will they be able to become professionally successful or not? And then they do become successful, but then you lose that tension, but it's replaced by the tension of the war. So now you have a different type of tension that Vernon might enlist and then become in danger and then eventually get killed. And that leads me to my third biggest difference is the characterization, because they don't feel exactly the same. In the first film, Vernon and Irene feel like they're equals, they're partners, but in the second film, Irene is kind of running that show. She is the one who is deciding their professional life and kind of driving it forward. And I think that's really interesting because she can decide their professional life and what they'll do as dancers and maybe even a little bit where they'll work, where they'll move, that kind of a thing. But Vernon makes the biggest choice of all to enlist in the army. And that's the one thing that she can't stop him doing. But she does try. She does try to influence him. And at first, he agrees with her. And then eventually he just says, no, I'm going to do my own thing. And that becomes the biggest choice in their life because then he dies. And maybe she had kind of a pain and an attitude against him when advising on the second film, because she still remembers that if he had just listened to me, then he would still be alive, and we would have been able to stay successful. We would have been able to stay successful. So I think those are three big changes. And in the characterization, their representation of real people in their lives was not accurate. In the first movie, their manager is a guy, when in real life, it's a lesbian. And in the first movie, they have a friend or attendant who's a black guy, and that's correct. And then in the second movie, they have a manager who is a lesbian, but their friend and attendant is now a white guy, which is not correct. And so they never got it right in either film. They messed up one or the other. So there are a number of large changes, even though they're about the same people. And even though the first one was made by both of them, and the second one was advised by one of them, somehow still they're both really different. I guess that's kind of like the summary of it. So when I figure out how to write all that out, I'll do my discussion post. Okay.